Today I will be giving my thoughts on Christopher Nolan's 2026 film, The Odyssey. I wouldn't call this a review exactly. I'll speak about it from an audience perspective, as well as from my perspective as a student of Homer's works and of the classics in general. I'll then try to judge the story and the message of the movie on its own terms. This is very important, I think, because adaptations of existing stories almost always choose to change events or themes in their journey from the page to the screen. That by itself does not determine the quality of the movie. As a good example, look at the 2002 Count of Monte Cristo. Tons of things were changed from the text to the movie. But it was a great movie because it had a good message, it was consistent with itself in delivering the message, and the audience was able to perceive what that message was. So when looking at this adaptation of the Odyssey, I'm not going to be complaining about the differences in the plot. I will be asking if those changes were worth it. Whether the film succeeded in doing what the film itself told us it was trying to do. Once this is done, I'll contrast the film's themes with those of the epic poem. Spoiler warning, of course. Being in the audience, my impression from the very start of the movie was that this should not be your first exposure to any of Christopher Nolan's films or your first exposure to Homer's Odyssey. You should go and fix at least one of those problems if you're going to watch this. Because I knew Nolan's tendency to avoid strict chronological order, and the fact that I knew many of the details of the original story made it easy for me to tell where in the narrative we were, where in the timeline we were, and I could switch back and forth between different times pretty easily without being disoriented. I enjoyed the action scenes, the sets, and I thought all the actors did a great job. There were no bad performances that I saw. I didn't necessarily like the direction that certain characters were taken, but that's a different complaint. That's a separate issue. For all the differences between the poem and the film, and there are major ones, every single similarity, reference, and homage to the text worked quite well for me. For example, I really loved the scene where Odysseus comes back to Ithaca and he turns his bow over in his hands and he tests it before finally stringing it. Whoever acted that or wrote that, probably both, had definitely read that scene in any version of the Odyssey, any translation, multiple times. And then I loved some of the things that were added. I loved how he always plucks his bow before firing. No, it wasn't in the text, but it was established as part of his personality, part of his hubris, maybe, and so consistent for him that when he finally does it, it's an announcement of his identity. And you did need that for that scene when he reveals himself, and Penelope and Antinous both respond to it as a true revelation of his identity. And their reaction was gold. I thought it worked very well. I want to briefly address immersion into the world of the Odyssey, because it came up a lot in the media ahead of the theatrical release of this film. Many people pointed out casting choices, dialogue, accents, and some of the costumes in the shots from the trailer and other stills as problems for realism and or immersion, but also as warning signs of an ideological motive. I agree that all of these could pose a problem for trying to put yourself into the ancient Greek world, into Homer's world, really, but I didn't get the sense that that's what Nolan was necessarily trying to do. So to judge this film on its own terms, I think I should instead try to see whatever world it is that the director is trying to show me, and then later compare it to Homer in terms of both ideas and aesthetics. So aesthetically, I think that there were several choices made for the sake of symbolism rather than any kind of realism. Agamemnon's armor, for example, is not meant to be period accurate. It's a presence of hubris and domination and ruthlessness. Similarly, the Laestrygonians' steel plate armor is definitely not period accurate, but next to the Greeks' bronze, and leather, it gives off the impression of their relative invincibility. That's not to say that I think all of the anachronisms in this movie were intentional or had a hidden meaning. I think many were probably oversights or carelessness or just the rule of cool. It's a movie. It happens all the time. Similarly, the casting made it clear to me that I wasn't supposed to be taking this as a realistic telling of a mythic tale, but rather as something closer to a Shakespearean stage play, where the actor's abilities in communicating the intricacies of a character were much more important than them matching the likely historical appearances of the real people that they were portraying. All of this is to say that from the beginning, I did not feel like I was being intentionally drawn into the world of ancient Greece to engage it. Rather, I felt that I was being drawn into the world of ideas to engage those. So I'm going to try to evaluate this movie in terms of its ideas rather than on any standard of realism. This next bit is going to be a mix of plot summary, analysis of themes, and of character development, not strictly in chronological order. The movie places lots of emphasis on what is called Zeus's Law, which for Nolan is nearly indistinguishable from the Golden Rule. Penelope actually recites it word for word: treat others as you would wish to be treated, and characters continually appeal to the possibility that the person in front of them may be a god in disguise. Speaking of which, the gods themselves are largely absent in this movie, or at least invisible, with a few exceptions, but that too is part of Odysseus' inner conflict. He dialogues with Athena, who's visible only to him, a few times during his journey, mainly about how difficult it is to hear and heed the voices of the gods. Athena typically responds to him by saying that he should not look for it explicitly stated as words, but instead as implicit, within the beauty and the experiences of life. These conversations with her occur on Calypso's island after all of his journeys on his ship with the crew. During said journeys, Odysseus seems much less concerned with the gods. That being said, though, when he does encounter the commands of the gods secondhand from Circe or from Tiresias or Calypso, he tends to take it seriously. This does not make it any easier for him to get home, though, as throughout the movie it's emphasized that Odysseus' sins and offenses are not against the gods directly, but against his fellow men, which might hurt the gods as a byproduct? Maybe? It's a little unclear. Throughout the encounters with monsters that the Odyssey is known for, like the Cyclops or Scylla and Charybdis, Odysseus recklessly endangers the lives of his comrades, does not prioritize giving them the due honors of burial, tells lies to and conceals the truth from them as needed. Each of these choices appear to be, from a modern view, understandable under the circumstances. But then, so is the anger and resentment that builds in his comrades as a result, and it is this that the Shades and Hades blame Odysseus for when he goes to them. We are told that the Shades of the underworld all crowd around the living for the sole purpose of hearing what has happened to those who wronged them. However, the hero's biggest moral offense is the fall of Troy. Nolan seems to want to portray the deception of the Trojan horse, together with the slaughter of Troy that comes afterward, as the ultimate violation of Zeus's law. This applies to appealing to common gods in order to lower the Trojans' guard, lying to the Greek soldier that's assigned to present the horse for that purpose, and the inhuman slaughter of the Trojans that follows. We are shown a moment when a statue of Athena was beheaded in Troy by a Greek soldier, side by side with another moment when some Greek soldiers were killing a Trojan woman, and Odysseus can see that she's, perhaps in retrospect or symbolically, actually Athena in disguise. At the beginning of the movie, Telemachus and Penelope talk about the people from the sea, these pirates or plunderers who have been going all over the Aegean and causing trouble, and it's eventually revealed that the people from the sea are these Trojan war veterans that failed to be redomesticated. The sack of Troy broke something crucial and deep in the very men who carried it out, and led to many more atrocities, culminating in the loss of order and goodwill toward others that the Greek civilization supposedly used to have before the war. Odysseus can see Athena, then, partially as a manifestation of his guilt. Although, presumably, the bulk of the post-war raids were carried out by other crews besides Odysseus's. We see Odysseus and his crew pillage one small town. After that, almost all of their landings are at the homes of monsters who are immediately hostile to them. The monsters weren't spreading the news of the people of the sea, I know that. And yet, when Odysseus' crew arrives at Circe's island, she immediately transforms them into animals and tells Odysseus confidently that they would have wronged her, even though they gave no indication of intending to do so. If we give her the benefit of the doubt, this confidence came from her past experiences with Greek crews, a story that's halfway told by all the old discarded armor outside of her house. All of that to say that somehow the Trojan War veterans built a reputation for piracy and plundering after the war, and practically speaking, it definitely was not just Odysseus' crew, even though we're never shown the actions of any others. Odysseus is portrayed as irreparably stained by his actions at Troy and every deception he employs with his crew on the way back. The Siren Song reveals that on some level he knows that he is stained, and on that same level he does not want to go home because that would bring Troy to Ithaca, to his home, as the people from the sea have brought Troy everywhere else they've gone. Calypso discovers Odysseus in the wreckage of his ship, takes him ashore, and can see that he's overcome with the guilt and trauma of all that he has done. She gives him the lotus flower to eat, to ease his mind and his conscience, but also slowly veils his memories. Nolan's Calypso ultimately wants to help Odysseus, but gets a little bit carried away with it, as she just likes having him around. As in the book, her island is a prison, but in the film, only she knows it. Once Odysseus regains his memories, he makes a raft and gives himself to the sea, taking a leap of faith in the gods that he will make it home. I'm not quite sure how this is a distinct leap of faith for him, but let's just assume that it is, for a moment. He then gets home and learns of the situation with the suitors. After rescuing Telemachus from their assassins, which is a task performed by Athena in the book, he decides to employ the violence and trickery he's come to be characterized by one last time in order to drive out the suitors. We are told throughout the movie, whenever it comes up with Telemachus or Penelope, that whoever would use violence to expel the suitors would be exiled for violating Zeus's law. Odysseus anticipates this and tells Telemachus and Eumaeus the swineherd not to get involved, but to let him do all of the fighting, so that he carries all of the blame himself. Nothing is said of the suitors' guilt in violating Zeus's law, or about any justice that's due to them for their actions. And thus, when Odysseus finishes killing most of them, he invites Penelope to go into exile with him, into the sunset, leaving Telemachus, unstained by guilt, as king. They are also leaving to go and give honor to the fallen comrades Odysseus left unburied, as he was ordered to in the underworld. The two look forward to the day that civilizational order is restored and acknowledge that their Bronze Age is ending. Do the ideas the movie tries to sell hold together on their own terms? I would argue no. The movie contradicts or obscures its most important moral points in several ways. The most important moral point that the movie gives us, and repeatedly tells us, is Zeus's law, which in Nolan's world means treat others as you would wish to be treated because they might be gods in disguise. This is given to us as the whole reason that all of Odysseus' deception, violence, hubris, or lack of decency in and since Troy was wrong. This, you would think, would be the meaning behind seeing Athena in the victims at Troy. It's Athena, after all, who tells Odysseus to look for the gods in their will implicitly in the world, and not explicitly per se. The message, then, is that Odysseus could see the image of the goddess Athena within the victim, but too late. The statue is also beheaded, and it is clear that Odysseus has offended the gods by offending his fellow man. This is consistent and matches the message that we were given. Good so far. However, the underworld scene makes no mention of the gods at all. Sinon berates Odysseus for how he wronged his fellow soldiers. Odysseus is tasked with going far inland after his homecoming to honor the unburied soldiers at last to make reparations, which was a journey done to appease Poseidon and to make reparations to him in the book. The gods in the scene are intentionally replaced with humans. But hold on a second. None of Odysseus' men or the dead veterans were gods in disguise. They're dead, and their shades are visible, so that's all but confirmed. So then, why is appeasing them necessary? Because they're angry at you, and they want you to share their disgrace? That's all we're really told. This is not Zeus's law, as it was explained to us. It doesn't negate it per se, but it either means that there are other moral messages that we are not being told, or that the definition of the first message is being changed and expanded in real time. This is disorienting, to say the least, but it's not necessarily a self-contradiction yet. Despite their absence from the ethical discussions in the underworld, the gods are still portrayed as quite real, though mostly unseen. Odysseus' men are punished exactly as predicted for eating the sun god's cattle. Polyphemus the Cyclops remains the son of Poseidon, just like in the text, and calls to him to curse Odysseus, just like in the text. And Calypso then urges Odysseus to have faith that he will make it home because Zeus will not allow Poseidon to kill him. Not only are the gods real, but they're portrayed as persons, even if they're not human persons, with a will, with commands and wishes that can be understood explicitly, not just in the wind and the waves, and implicitly in the world, like Athena says. This part is consistent with Nolan's version of Zeus's law, and confirms the existence of other laws from the gods, but none of them are relevant to the issues that were addressed in the underworld scene, which just makes it even more confusing as to why they weren't mentioned. After this, in Pylos, Odysseus saves his son from the suitors' assassins, which again is a task done by the gods, by Athena in the book, but not before the assassins kill Mentor. The father and son have to leave in a hurry, and Odysseus insists that they do not have time to bury Mentor. Telemachus protests, looking down at the body of the one person who, in the book, was definitely a god in disguise, and says, "But he might be a god in disguise! We have to bury him!" And Odysseus immediately rejects this, opting to burn the temple that they're standing in, where Mentor is lying, as a way of doing something instead of nothing. Or maybe it was just to cause enough confusion to allow them to get back to their ship. Either way, if you dismiss the importance of the possibility of Mentor being a god, when in the text that's exactly who Mentor is in most of his appearances, there are at least a few things going on. First, the dramatic irony employed tells us, the audience, that we shouldn't care if the humans are gods in disguise either. It's almost like it's saying, so what if they are? Second, at this point in Homer's story, Odysseus is supposed to have learned his lesson. Nolan's Odysseus is probably learning a different lesson, but that's still the structure of the story. So how could Odysseus justify not burying Mentor? Since he's supposed to go and make reparations for unburied comrades later anyway, perhaps he says to himself, what's one more? Very pragmatic, but the Underworld episode made it clear that his comrades took not being buried and being wronged and lied to personally. So let's interpret it in terms of personal relations. How well would it go if you were on your way to apologizing to your spouse for doing something and on your way decided to do it one more time, because what's one more thing for her to forgive? Anyway, this communicates that Odysseus has not necessarily decided to change anything about his behavior at this point. In the moment, he justifies his actions the exact same way as all the other times, pragmatically. And pragmatically, it did not make sense for him to bury Mentor, so he did not. Soon he'll say to Telemachus, I think, I will bring it all back to Ithaca, meaning all of his lies, all of his deceits, all of his violence, and yes, his mistakes and his sins. He's not changing. This is a very different Odysseus than Homer. Odysseus also says to his son at some point close to this, don't look for the gods in men. You'll always be disappointed. Now this completely undermines Nolan's Zeus's law. If you define it as treating your fellows well to avoid offending gods in disguise, then Odysseus clearly does not care about that. If it's about treating them well for their own sake, then his behavior is clearly not really changing even so. So then what's left? The ending tells us, but continues to confuse. The suitors have clearly violated Nolan's Zeus's law, as well as any standards of human decency available. However, the movie is clear that this does not change the consequences of choosing to fight them off, if one were to do so. The elders, I think, would have you exiled for doing so after the suitors' families would come to get revenge. Odysseus tells his son not to get involved in killing the suitors, but to let him do it all, so that he can't be blamed. This prevents Telemachus from being exiled and allows him to become king at the end. Telemachus assists his father in other ways, but not in the actual fighting. There are several problems here. There is no consequence of justice for the suitors from the law, despite their attempts on the lives of several people in the household, and the ongoing theft of the king's resources. But there is a consequence for Odysseus wanting to put a stop to it violently himself. We're not told why this discrepancy is here. Homer does not have this problem because, in his case, the king's return with the sword is justice. There is no other law enforcement or human authority to appeal to. And that's why the suitors have remained unchecked for 3 years prior to Odysseus' arrival. Homer's Odysseus is not criminally responsible for carrying out justice, but Nolan's is, which brings about a paradox. On the one hand, if Odysseus is guilty of breaking Zeus's law by killing the suitors, then so are the suitors for their treatment of the king's household, of his son. They tried to have him killed. If the authority exists to force Odysseus into exile for killing them, then it should also exist to exile the suitors, which would have prevented Odysseus from needing to kill them in the first place. But putting that aside, there's an even bigger problem. Let's take for granted that Odysseus' actions on Ithaca were terrible on the basis of Zeus's law, as Nolan's defined it, or ambiguously portrayed it at least. In that case, he killed the suitors because it was useful to save his wife and for Telemachus to become king. Telemachus and Penelope have no problem with Odysseus' actions, even though Telemachus chooses not to participate to keep his hands clean. This all-important moral standard that we're shown is treated as good only insofar as it is useful, and that's it. Whenever these elders show up to ask what happened, Telemachus will ostensibly be left saying, "Yeah, that sure was bad what Odysseus did, and oh yes, he definitely deserved to be exiled, but boy am I glad he did it." The pragmatic use of the action remains the bottom line. This is not the way to make a moral point in a story. It's reminiscent of the end of The Dark Knight, another Nolan movie where Batman makes an agreement with his allies to lie about Harvey Dent's true nature because basically it's more useful for law and order if Dent is the hero. Batman then chooses to take all the blame for Dent's crimes onto himself and leaves polite society. Odysseus takes the same role as Batman. He does the morally bad thing, lying in Batman's case, and Odysseus' case killing, because it is useful, so that the good guys don't have to do it, and can keep being good. But if it's okay to do it on Ithaca, then what was wrong with doing it at Troy? In Batman's case, though, there is another movie after that to show the consequences of such contradictions, and the consequences of violating truth and compromising your moral standards for utility's sake. The Odyssey, however, will have no such sequel, and thus, as a thinking, analyzing viewer, I'm left at best confused and at the worst disturbed by the implications of what appears to be a kind of Machiavellian utilitarianism, in which the appearance of righteousness, or righteousness on paper, is more important as righteousness itself. So if you take it all together, no, I do not believe this movie succeeded in delivering a coherent, thematic message. But maybe I missed the point. Let me know down below if you thought so. Now I'll compare it to Homer a little bit. I think part of why this failure happened is a covert clash of values that the director himself may not be fully aware of. We all probably know that the Golden Rule is not from Homer or from any ancient Greek source, but actually from Christ, in the Bible. In Homer, Zeus's law covers some of the same ground, but it's far from identical. The law referred to, Zeus's law, is actually called Xenia, and it governs the relationship between host and guest in the ancient Greek world. Hosts were to welcome guests, expected or not, identified or not, give them food, drink, protection, and rest, and only once they've eaten can they be asked what their business is or who they are. Once the guest desires to go, though, he or she is to be sped on the way, loaded with gifts from the host. If a particular gift is inappropriate or not suitable, then the guest can ask for a substitute. The guest must respect the host's family and property. All of this is visible in the pages of Homer, as are its violations. Odysseus' encounters with the Cyclops, Circe, and Calypso all represent hosts who do not respect their guests, try to harm them, fail to speed them off, or refuse to let them go. Even Nestor is considered a somewhat overbearing host to Telemachus, and that is why Telemachus avoids stopping at his house a second time. However, we are also shown guests that violate Xenia that are presented as such. The suitors are the most egregious example, but Paris, the Prince of Troy, also violated Xenia by kidnapping or running off with Helen, his host's wife. The Trojan War was kicked off by a violation of Xenia. Let that sink in. Now, Nolan was partially right about the reasoning behind Xenia. There was a real possibility in the mind of the ancient Greeks that their guests, or hosts, may be gods in disguise. However, that was not the only reason to abide by it. The reason it's referred to as Zeus's law, specifically, is because Zeus himself identifies as the patron of strangers and travelers far from home. Carolyn DeWald explained it to me this way in our conversation about Herodotus. You could kill your guest in his sleep because you coveted his sword and then bury him in the backyard, but then Zeus, whose domain is the sky, would see you doing so. This isn't a universal compassion for all humanity from the gods, though. This is a specific protection over the relationship between host and guest. Odysseus even refers to Zeus as Zeus of the strangers, when he's asking the Cyclops, Polyphemus, for hospitality. Historically, Xenia was a necessity in the Mediterranean world, in which piracy became rampant whenever there was not a strong, centralized power that could quell it. And that even applies to modern and relatively recent times, you'd be surprised. But despite that, strangely enough, piracy was not considered an unlawful or dishonorable profession at the time of Homer, according to both the ancient and the modern scholars of his work. Most of them point to Nestor asking his guests whether they were pirates after welcoming and feeding them, politely at the table versus at sword point at the door. Polyphemus uses the exact same words to inquire into Odysseus' profession, and in Homer, because these poems were recited, if you have the same poetic formula, it's reasonable to say that the same phrase is being used for the same purpose. Odysseus even tells Penelope at the end of the poem that he intends to restore his house's supplies and wealth with a whole bunch of raids. Ancient Greek Xenia actually fits very neatly into the story of the Odyssey. You can use it to understand the morality of each episode of the Odyssey from the ancient Greeks' perspective. Odysseus' piracy of the Cocones doesn't apply, and not dishonorable either. How about the Cyclops? Well, he was a bad host, justly punishable. The suitors, bad guests, also justly punishable. Circe and Odysseus together. Bad host and a bad guest, perhaps. The Trojan War? Well, Paris violates Xenia, and no one else. Nolan runs into problems, I think, because his version of Zeus's law does not fit nearly as well into the events of the Homeric epic, especially when the reason that we're given behind Zeus's law doesn't really fit consistently in each episode, and it's not applied universally either. The Golden Rule in and of itself, without the pseudo-grounding in ancient Greek Xenia, actually fits much better into the events of Nolan's Odyssey, but it still leads to contradictions in the plot. Ultimately, the Odyssey was not made as a Christian story exemplifying the Golden Rule, even though it anticipates parts of that worldview. It was made as a story exemplifying ancient Greek moral values, and even though I enjoyed watching it as an action or an adventure movie, I didn't enjoy thinking about it and analyzing it after the fact, because, in retrospect, I can see that Nolan was trying to put a square peg into a round hole, and it's really obvious, and for me, it does not fit. Not even by sanding down the edges, that's the plot, and adjusting the themes. So, I hope you enjoyed the movie for what it's worth, but seriously, go read the book. Read a time-tested translation, at least a couple decades old, that's faithful to the original Greek. I use Fagles. Homer's Odyssey contains many different themes and ideas to explore besides Xenia, though. There's moderation and its value, hubris and its consequences, and the various complex relationships between men and women. They're all in there. If you're interested in seeing some analyses of such ideas while you read it, click right here. Thanks for watching.